Hi, Tony and I want to welcome you to our study today. We're going to look for our third and final time at the book of Hosea. Hosea, more than any other Old Testament prophet, maybe with the exception of Jeremiah, gives the picture of the inner working of God's heart. We can look at him like if you've ever been to the jewelry store and picked out a piece of jewelry, they'll put out a black piece of velvet and put the jewelry on top of it. Well, the life of the northern kingdom, Israel, was the dark part. And God's goodness, like the jewel on it, is the good part. We're going to look at both sides. So God called his people, and Tony's going to read that.
Return, O Israel, to the Lord your God, for you have stumbled because of your iniquity.
Now, that's God's call, return. Unfortunately, their pride caused them to think that they knew better than God, and so they didn't return.
Israel's pride testifies against him, yet they do not return to the Lord their God or seek him for all this.
It's like Israel had a 911 to call out to God, and so they would call out to God for help, but instead of listening to his direction, they went their own way.
Israel cries to me, my God, we, Israel, know you. They made kings, but not through me. They set up princes, but without my knowledge. With their silver and gold they made idols for their own destruction. Though I write for him the multitude of my instructions, they are regarded as a strange thing.
So the people prayed. They believed they were in a relationship with God, but their devotion to idols told the real story. They were so bent on following their own self-will, they refused to follow God's guidance. The setting in the northern kingdom, Israel, there's also a term for that called Ephraim. The setting for that was a time of prosperity under King Jeroboam. And under their prosperity, they did not worship God in thankfulness, but rather they built more altars and they erected pillars to Baal, the god of the land.
Israel is a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit. The more his fruit increased, the more altars he built. As his country improved, he improved his pillars.
If you've been counting, Tony and I gave you 3 examples. If you read all of the 14 chapters of Hosea, you'll find a number of other instances. There's one word that describes what they did, and that word is apostasy. That's a word we don't use very often. Apostasy can be described like this. You walk right up to the truth, you look truth right in the eye, and then you turn away from it and you do what you want to do. Now, that was the fundamental sin of the northern kingdom. We have to ask ourselves how we are guilty of that sin ourselves. Well, that's the dark part. That's the black velvet that we're going to put the jewel of God's goodness on. So Baal was an owner. That's the literal meaning of Baal, owner. But God is love, and he does love people, even people who are rebellious and selfish.
When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more I called them, the more they went from me. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and offering incense to idols.
The exodus from Egypt was the standard of God's love for Israel. He had taken them out of slavery. For people in our day, the cross of Christ is the standard of God's love for us. There he freed us from our sins and our wrongdoing. But here's the question for us. Do we accept what God has done for us? Do we accept his love and yet at the same time try to serve our addictions, our substitutes for God's, or our own self-will? Now, I said a moment ago, Ephraim is God's special word, kind of like a pet name for the northern kingdom, Israel. So here are tender words that God spoke to Israel. But I'd like you also to notice the underlying deep hurt and pain as God reaches out to his people.
Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. I bent down to them and fed them.
That's in chapter 11 of Hosea. And you may want to look to that and just kind of meditate on some thoughts. How many times have you been healed by God? How many times have you experienced God's love for you? How many times has he just blessed you and helped you? And yet, instead of returning to his love, this is the question for us. Instead of returning love for love, have we seen God as someone that we could use? That was the problem of the people in the northern kingdom. They didn't want a God to love, they wanted a God to use. Now, his amazing character is on display on how he responded to them. Let me give you a couple of names that will be interesting for us. Adamah and Zeboim. Those are two cities that were destroyed when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. Now, Tony's going to read for us, and you think about those cities. That's part of the story.
How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? How can I make you like Adamah? How can I treat you like Zebulun? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my fierce anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim. For I am God and no mortal, the Holy One in your midst, and I will not come in wrath.
I think one of the most important words that we will read in the entire Old Testament is the phrase, I am God and not mortals. Let me repeat that. I am God and not mortals. When we go to the cross of Christ, we see, like never before, he is God. He does not respond like we do. He takes our injury, our hurt, our pain, our wrongdoing, our rebellion, our self-centeredness, and all the stuff that we do that is so awful. And instead of striking us down and turning us to toast, he goes to the cross and he dies on the cross for our sins. Now, the most important thing to learn from the book of Hosea, I believe, and the most aha moment I got out of reading Hosea again, was the difference between using God for myself versus loving God for himself. And I have been challenged to up my expression of love to God, to find ways to tell him how much I love him, as opposed to just asking him for things. So I suggest that you would do that too. Tomorrow we're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 6. We're going back and forth. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, we're going to talk about how self-giving love can be applied to problem solving in our lives. God bless you. Have a great day. We'll see you tomorrow.